A few years ago, my family physician and I discovered that we had a mutual love of fishing. And as a result, we often now talk about when we've been fishing, or more often than not, our desire to go fishing and the fact that we just haven't found the time. That love of fishing creates a bond between us that makes our visits more pleasant. It's a little bit different than the experience I had with another physician who I grew up with. This is a doctor who was from my family church. And years later, when I was a young adult, him and I actually went fishing together. Now, that isn't a physician that serves me on a regular basis, but when I was in grade 7 and I cut my knee open, just so happened to do so while I was fishing, Dr. Nunn's the one that gave me stitches and staples. The reality is the relationship that we have with medical professionals can be very complex. And this is because often we're engaging with these professionals because of some of the situations that we find ourselves in, which are often very challenging. For example, when we are or are caring for those that are ill, or perhaps are on their deathbeds. And while this relationship can be complicated at the best of times, it's even more complicated when it intersects with our personal lives. The relationships that we form with these professionals are super important because they build the foundation of trust in healthcare. But what happens when the lines between professional and personal blur too much? From gifts and favors, to dual relations in tight-knit communities, to examples when there's exploitation and simply assaults. This lesson will explore how subtle shifts in these relationships can impact both the provider and patients, creating complications that go way beyond the exam room. So today we're going to unravel those layers and consider how to uphold trust in professionalism in healthcare. So we're going to start by examining a little bit of the darker side of these interactions. Situations where the boundaries are crossed, the trust is strained, and the ethical dilemma arises. Recall the case of Norberg and Weinrib. Here, a doctor offered to continue an addicted patient's prescription for narcotics if she submitted to his sexual advances. The young woman had reluctantly agreed to this arrangement only after she failed to secure another source of supply. Now, after recovering from her addiction, the woman then sued the doctor in battery, negligence, and breach of fiduciary duty. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld the woman's claim, unanimously awarding her $20,000 in compensatory damages and additional $10,000 in punitive damages, although they did so for slightly different reasons. The majority of the court held that her claim in battery, which states that you can't have offensive bodily contact without consent, was upheld because it was impossible for the woman to meaningfully consent given the parties' unequal power and the exploitative nature of the relationship. Now, one justice had disagreed with this and held that the young woman consented to the sexual advances were not vitiated because she had done so freely. That's questionable, but he did hold the doctor liable on negligence for breaching the standard of care by facilitating her addiction rather than treating it. Some of the other justices based the doctor's liability on the action for the breach of fiduciary duty to the patient. In their view, the wrong that occurred in this case was the doctor's exploitation of this relationship of trust with the patient to gratify his own sexual needs at her expense. Now, we've mentioned this in class before that one set of facts or circumstances can give rise to numerous types of claims, and Norberg and Weinrib demonstrates that a court may actually find liability for different reasons. Now, there are several different frameworks or approaches that actually can be explored in this case. Let's look first at the legal frameworks that govern it. First, there are some specific civil implications here, specifically battery and the breach of fiduciary duty. So if you recall that battery is an offensive bodily contact without consent, the Supreme Court here acknowledged that Dr. Weinrib's actions, the sexual assault, as constituting battery. The legal framework provided the basis for determining that Norberg's consent was invalid due to the coercion and exploitation stemming from that power imbalance that exists in the doctor and patient relationship. The second claim, the fiduciary duty, arises in relationships where there's an expectation that one party will work in the best interest of another. For example, a physician, as a fiduciary to their patients, is required to act not in their own interest, but in the interest of the patient. And here, Dr. Weinrib's actions breached this duty by exploiting the dependency the young woman had on him for medication, i.e., he wasn't looking out for her best interest in that moment. This case also touches on consent. It recognizes that consent obtained through coercion, manipulation, or exploitation of a power dynamic isn't valid. But it's more than just legal issues at play here. There's also ethical issues. And we think of some of these issues using the same language. There's an ethical duty to uphold the fiduciary obligations. There's also ethical ideas around trust. The doctor-patient relationship requires trust and prioritization of a patient's well-being. And Dr. Weinrib exploited this by conditioning medical treatment on sexual favors. He violated the ethical principles of the profession and abused his position of power. The power imbalance between Dr. Weinrib and Ms. Norberg meant that he had significant authority and power over her because of his position, and that he had controlled access to the narcotics. Doctors are supposed to act with non-maleficence and beneficence. And in the case of non-maleficence, Dr. Weinrib actually exploited Norberg's addiction and vulnerability in exchange for favors for himself. His actions constituted a psychological harm, an emotional harm, a sexual assault, and the undermining of the dignity and trust of Weinrib. But also in the sense of beneficence, Dr. Weinrib prioritized his own interests over the patient's health and welfare. So instead of providing appropriate medical treatment to support recovery, he leveraged dependence for personal gain, thereby neglecting his ethical responsibility to provide compassionate and effective care. The dual relationship that emerged here was that Dr. Weinrib, as Norberg's physician, despite having a duty to prioritize her medical well-being and uphold professional boundaries, by conditioning medical treatments on sexual favors, he blurred those lines between the professional obligations and the personal exploitation. Beyond the legal and the ethical, there's also professional obligations. The provincial medical regulatory body, here the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, has policies on sexual misconduct. The college has a zero tolerance policy for this because clear professional boundaries ensure the protection both of patients and doctors. Now, a violation of that could have several outcomes, including the suspension of a medical license, fines or penalties, mandated treatment or education, or some sort of restrictions on their practice, like supervision and monitoring. Let's also not forget the impact on the patient. There's a physical reality for Ms. Norberg. Her dependency was exploited, worsening her vulnerability and undermining her ability to seek appropriate treatment or help. And of course, there's an emotional impact with the betrayal of the trust relationship and the shame and the guilt that would come from that. Now, sexual misconduct in medicine shouldn't occur. This should really go without saying. It's not really a gray area. Of course, physicians shouldn't exploit their patients. And yet, it seems to be highly problematic. Now, before we talk specifically about doctors, it is important to note that this kind of mirrors the reality in society. And it is a giant red flag for the legal system. There are clearly shortcomings in how we deal with and how we respond to sexual assault and sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. Now, we can't get into all of that here, but note that the problems that exist in the medical profession and healthcare are simply a microcosm of a broader problem, and one that we really have to take more seriously, and something that is really critically undermining the trust that many of us have in the legal system. If the legal system cannot protect the autonomy of a woman's body at a basic fundamental level, then I don't really care if it can protect money. But putting that aside right now and noting the giant red flag that should go off in your head about this system, we have to talk about the predators that clearly make it into healthcare. Consider the story of a Kitchener neurologist named Dr. Slawka, who's been implicated in over 70 counts of sexual assault. Now, his trial started in 2021, but has, for a variety of reasons, been postponed, delays, other things. And it was supposed to resume in February, though, to be honest, I don't know if it started. The wheels of justice here can be extremely slow. And of course, that's going to impact the victims of these sexual assaults. In one of the news accounts, a mother of one of Slawka's victims noted that it's impacted her daughter's relationship with medicine so profoundly that at one point when she needed care from a hospital, they drove to Woodstock and back for 3 days because she was too traumatized to go to a hospital in Kitchener. How does a neurologist sexually assault 70 different people or have 70 different counts of assault against him and still practice? And before anyone jumps in and says, well, you can't address problems that no one reports and that maybe those reports only came in after the fact, you have to stop and consider the case of Elazar Narija. Narija is a disgraced pediatrician who was employed for over 40 years despite multiple suspensions and disciplinary hearings related to sexual abuse. A pediatrician and sexual abuse, this was with children. Here, an organization that we'll look into more when we talk about negligence, the Canadian Medical Protective Association, has helped to shield doctors like Dr. Narija. It's a multi-billion-dollar organization that is publicly funded, that has helped essentially protect predators. Now, the college eventually revoked Narija's medical license, but it took time. And this raises some concerns about the college. And, while it's meant to regulate physicians, they're ultimately in a conflict and frankly just aren't equipped. But what does it mean for there to be a giant protective agency to protect doctors against claims from patients who have been hurt? And what does it mean when we think about discipline to have doctors judging the behavior of other doctors? Of the various panels, for example, that judged Narija's 4 different professional hearings, the majority of the panel members were doctors. Only 7 of 18 were not doctors. Now, the CPSO has a zero tolerance policy, but this continues to happen. And the reality is that there are concerns that a doctor might be reluctant to hold other colleagues to account because some of the kind of complaints may make them feel uncomfortable about their own practices, or maybe boundaries that they're not sure about. There have been sexual misconduct complaints that aren't just overt sexual assault, but how doctors make women feel, for example, during a breast exam, or the types of things that they say. The reality is that this is a clear area where that patient relationship, the boundaries have been blurred. Doctors are not supposed to actually engage in sexual assault and sexual exploitation. So this is pretty clear, and yet it still happens. But there are a number of other ways in which boundary violations can occur.
In the fall, I had several students help put together some of the content for these videos, identifying the readings, helping to try to write a transcript, identifying clips from shows. The student that helped with this particular lesson, Melissa, grabbed some clips from some very popular shows that I haven't watched for the most part, but nevertheless that were pertinent to our discussion. Now, in making some of the earlier videos, I actually ran into some trouble using copyrighted material, so I'm not exactly sure how to incorporate this. I think this is fair use, and if I was in class, I could just show you, but to record it and post it on YouTube is a little bit more challenging. So I'm trying to circumvent just a pure cut and paste by maybe making a video with a video in it. So this is clip number 1.
On the street we're turning and what we can't. Looked them in the eyes and they sang.
So I wasn't one of the 7.
Someone here, we have found this. Hallelujah, hallelujah.
It's past midnight, but only 6.
Why are you crying?
I'm not crying.
You are too.
Hallelujah, hallelujah. The people in the street started their sins. Took
I cannot fall for a patient.
hallelujah, hallelujah.
Okay. Good luck with that.
Every knee will bow and every tongue confess. I'm the voice of one crying in a wilderness, crying out, hallelujah.
Find a penny, pick it up, and all day long, you'll have good luck.
Here, Izzy and the patient Denny started a romantic relationship while Denny was under Izzy's care. Now, according to the CMPA, a relationship like this, a romantic or sexual relationship between a physician and a current patient, is inappropriate and prohibited. There's an inherent power balance, thus all these types of relationships are classified as sexual abuse. The college's policy on boundary violation clearly states that physicians must not engage in sexual relations with the patient, touch a patient in a sexual manner, or engage in behavior or make remarks of a sexual nature towards a patient. This requires physicians to not also make sexual comments or advances or to respond sexually. They're required to obtain proper consent and provide proper information, and when doing examinations, to use gloves. It also is an imperative that physicians not make comments about a patient's sexual history unless it's relevant to the course of treatment or the examination, or make any comments about their own sex life, or to communicate or socialize a patient for the purposes of pursuing a sexual relationship. Now, people are people, and it's not surprising that in a physician-patient relationship, there may be attraction or interest, or that parties may actually fall in love. And provided that they're consenting adults, there really isn't a problem with this, provided that sufficient time has passed. The college has provided guidance on when a physician may pursue a relationship with a patient, and notes that it has to be after 1 year of seeing them, or longer depending on the circumstances. The Regulated Health Professional Act states that an individual is considered a patient if they saw a physician within 1 year, or perhaps when there's a longer period required. The CPSO notes that even after a 1 year time period has passed, it may be inappropriate or amount to professional misconduct for a physician to engage in a sexual relationship with a former patient. So prior to engaging in sexual relationship with a former patient, a physician has to consider the following factors, like the length and intensity of the former professional relationship, the nature of the patient's clinical problems, or the type of clinical care that was provided, or if there was psychotherapy received, and the extent to which the patient has confided personal or private information to the physician, as well as the vulnerability the patient had in that particular physician-patient relationship. This is because there are some relationships where it may never be appropriate for the physician to pursue a sexual relationship. And this is not just about patients. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has also provided guidance on persons closely associated with a patient. Think here of a patient's family member. This kind of a relationship may also be deemed to be professional misconduct, depending on the type of treatment and the nature of the relationship between the physician and the patient. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why we do not allow these types of relationships to continue.
Okay. Are you ready?
Wait, what are you doing?
Try lust or coveting, and you'll only hurt yourself and probably one or two others. But anger is the worst.
Okay, we're done. What was that?
Were those gunshots? The mother of all sins.
Petey?
Denny, if there really is some kind of big glowy light,
I'm gonna try to get stay out of it.
exactly.
I don't like the sound of this.
Just to make sure nobody comes through that door.
What are you doing?
I'm stopping his heart, George.
Not only can anger drive you over the edge, when it does, you can take an awful lot of other people with you.
Easy.
I need some help!
It's okay. Rick will be here in a minute.
Izzy's deep emotional connection with Denny influenced her decision-making, leading her to act unethically and endanger his life and risk her career. The bias that was introduced into decision-making by romantic feelings resulted in a risky and unethical decision to move Denny up the transplant list. These actions damaged not only Izzy's reputation among her peers, but put the hospital's credibility at risk. And of course, there were potential impacts on the patient. This kind of decision-making may result in substandard treatment. If the decision is informed by one's romantic feelings and not by what's medically indicated, there is a risk that there could be substandard treatment. Here, Denny suffered an immediate risk. That may not always happen, but it certainly will undermine trust. Even though Denny did care deeply for Izzy and agreed to the plan, it raises questions about the balance of trust and ethics in these types of relationships. He was actually placed into a vulnerable position where he trusted his doctor, not just as a healthcare provider, making an informed decision on the medical and evidentiary basis before the physician, but because of someone with whom he had an emotional relationship. This trust was compromised by the unprofessional nature of her decision. Further, the stress and anxiety that resulted would have worsened the mental state due to being put into a situation where health is now at a serious risk. But it's not just about sex. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario notes that physicians must establish and maintain appropriate boundaries with patients at all times, including with respect to social or financial and business matters. And they must not exploit the power imbalance that's inherent in the physician-patient relationship. Physicians have to consider the impact on the physician-patient relationship and on other patients in their practice when engaging with a patient in a non-clinical context, whether that be social, financial, or business. So let's look at something a little less obvious, such as asking a friend or family member for medical advice. Is this appropriate? I'm sure many of you have done this, and if you have a family member who's a physician, it's not uncommon for that physician to opine on whether you have a cold or should seek additional care. Do we care when someone goes to a family member or a friend for advice? And why does it matter? Consider again the case of Ezekiel Stevens. Here, the Stevens family had a friend who was a nurse, Terry Menders, and she came to the house when Ezekiel was sick. And she suggested that Ezekiel might have viral meningitis and tells Colette Stevens, the mother, that she should take him to the doctors. Now, during the visit from the nurse friend, Ezekiel's mother understood that bacterial meningitis was extremely serious, and yet they did not take Ezekiel to the doctor. Instead, the parents resumed the olive leaf extract, garlic, and supplement regime. Ultimately, Ezekiel Stevens passed away. One of the challenges here is that when we are having family members or friends opine on medical treatment, there might be not an assurance that there's going to be quality of care. A patient may receive incomplete or inaccurate advice since the practitioner is offering this guidance outside of the formal consultation setting, without full access to a medical history or proper diagnostic tools. There also may be delays in proper treatment. Relying on informal advice might actually prevent someone from seeking professional medical care, potentially worsening the patient's condition, particularly if the advice is incorrect or insufficient. And there's also a toll on the healthcare practitioner, right? The practitioner may feel the burden of responsibility for having given bad advice or providing advice without the support of proper medical documentation, consultations, or collaborations that come with formal practice. And of course, there's the overarching concern of reduced objectivity. The patient or the patient's parents, as the case was here, might receive advice that is less impartial due to the personal connection. The practitioner may be influenced by emotions or familiarity, potentially leading to biased or less thorough recommendations. Ms. Menders might have not reported the Stevens family because they were friends, but had this been a random patient in their office, she might have acted differently. The emerging theme through all this is that there's an undermining of trust, which is foundational for the relationship, that a patient needs to be able to rely on what a practitioner is saying.
Well, we're done. It was the perfect crime. The police don't have shit. The only people who know what actually fucking happened are in this room. And for your sake, Doc, it had better stay that way. Hey, Papa, let's go.
Boys, wait. Come on, guys. We're in this together, right? Before you go, take this.
What is Automax?
That is a small company that I helped start. I think it would be a great investment opportunity for you. I think I could be a lot more to you boys than just a therapist. We ought to be business partners.
Yeah, okay. I'll look into it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doc.
Okay, sure.
According to the CMPA, doctors should steer clear of engaging in business relationships with patients, as these dual relationships can create conflicts of interest or potentially reduce clinical impartiality or even potentially compromise the medical judgment. Introducing personal matters into the professional relationship can negatively impact the quality of care provided and carry significant potential consequences. For example, a patient may feel coerced. Again, there's an inherent power balance between a doctor and a patient, which may lead a patient to feel obligated to agree to a personal transaction. It also may result in anxiety, where a patient may worry that declining could affect the rapport they have with their doctor or the standard of care they receive. And a doctor themselves may be impacted. For example, they may recognize that the dual relationship blurs professional boundaries and may impair their objective decision making and potentially compromise the quality of medical care they're offering. It also may result in strained relationships. If issues arise in the business arrangement, it could strain that doctor-patient relationship, potentially leading to the breakdown in trust and communication. And so for many reasons, we have to be very careful about drawing boundaries. And that includes with receiving gifts from a patient.
Hi, I'm Art Kaplan. I'm at the Division of Medical Ethics at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. I'm going to talk to you about a case drawn out of my clinical case ethics experience. This was really a surprise, very, very interesting. I think there may be a lot of diversity of opinion about this case. It's not about medical intervention. It actually is about a situation that was presented to me by a physician friend. He said it was hypothetical. I kind of think it was real, but in any event, famous artist that was undergoing treatment, we'll call him Pablo, was undergoing deep brain stimulation, where you put a needle into the brain and stimulate an area of the brain for tremors. He had Parkinsonism, and it kept him, as it got worse, from being able to paint for the past few years. But this newer intervention, the so-called deep brain stimulation, which is being made available in many, many hospitals around the world now, it helped stop his tremors. And indeed, he began to return to painting and return to his art. And he was very grateful for this. He had been just despondent that he couldn't pursue his art. And Pablo painted a little picture and said, I want to give it to you, the doctor, as a gift. And it's just out of my gratitude. He said, I was even thinking about committing suicide if I couldn't paint anymore. And now I'm back, and my gratitude really knows no bounds. Well, one problem that the doctor faced is that Pablo's paintings go for millions of dollars. They don't cost the artist anything, and there's no value in a sense when he gives the little gift to the doctor. But there's a market, and Pablo's work really was out there as something that could be resold and used to make a huge profit. Now, this isn't quite getting brownies from a grateful patient, which I know goes on and I don't have any heartburn about, but ethically, a lot of institutions say you cannot accept gifts from grateful patients. The doctor said, yeah, but this painting isn't really valuable unless I resell it. My own attitude was, well, you have to think harder about how it's going to be viewed in terms of its value. Its value isn't whether you intend to try and resell it and make the money. Its value is what it is on the open market, and I think you just got a gift that you shouldn't take because it is worth millions of dollars. Well, is that it? You can't accept the little painting? My suggestion might be, look, instead of making that as a gift to the doctor who did the treatment that got rid of the tremors and let Pablo come back to a world of active painting, maybe the gift could be made to the department or to the medical school or the hospital, and it could become part of their ownership, and they can handle the tax implications or whatever else there might be. But it would not be a violation of the idea that grateful patients should not be expected, allowed, permitted, give individual doctors huge gifts. I know that fundraising often goes on where a doctor asks a patient who's had a good experience if they'd be willing to contribute money to research to support activities at the hospital. And I think the little painting falls into this category. It's something that ethically you want to use its value to bolster more access to people who might benefit from neurosurgical interventions, more access to doctors, postdocs, fellows, residents who can get trained in doing improved versions of deep brain stimulation within your department, or just to help the hospital or medical center overall. I think that's acceptable. I think we all understand that, gift giving is part of philanthropy. So no to the individual doctor taking the little painting. Yes to taking that little painting and putting it to use under the aegis or ownership of the department or the institution. I'm Art Kaplan at the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. Thanks for watching.
A gift may result in expectations of preferential treatment. It might make it difficult for the patient to understand the limits of the relationship, or they might misinterpret the relationship as becoming dependent on gifts rather than on the professional commitment to providing high quality care. There's also an impact that could happen for physicians. It may result in bias, that a physician may subconsciously feel compelled to reciprocate the patient's generosity, impacting their clinical judgment, and maybe even leading to unequal treatment of other patients. There's also other issues with just basic things like human touch. Touch can be interpreted as sexual or inappropriate. It's also really important. When Jovi died, the vet that informed me that she had passed away saw that I was distraught and asked me if I wanted a hug. And I said yes. I needed that moment to have that comfort because I was so just taken aback. There needs to be careful and sound clinical judgment when using touch for supportive and clinical reasons, right? The idea that you might offer a patient a hug isn't the problem, but a doctor has to be careful about how they actually offer that. That comfort and reassurance needs to be brief, non-invasive, but they also need to make sure that a patient's comfortable with this. It can be a very fine line. This even occurs in some medical procedures that require physical examinations. When is physical touch appropriate? When is it clinically necessary? Is there patient consent? Is it personal or intimate? Is there any potential, the perception that the power imbalance is being exploited? Because this could result in emotional trauma or shame or guilt or the erosion of trust on the patient, and could have implications for the doctor, even if unintended, including legal consequences or reputational damages.